Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm going to be feeding my European nightcrawlers today. Some of my European nightcrawlers reside down here in this VERMIBAG mini. And I think we'll begin here. We usually start with my VERMIBAG mini. And then we'll make our way to a tray in which I've got other European nightcrawlers. And the food that I've got set aside here for them is set out here on the table. One of these trays is for the other container. So this one, we'll just put this one aside. So it's the one right here. This is the tray that we're going to feed this bin with today. It's a couple cantaloupe rinds, a couple banana peels, not a whole lot. I've got grit again. We did give them grit a week ago. It was a week ago last that I fed these European nightcrawlers. And then I've got a pretty good amount of coffee. This thing's almost full. So we'll give half to this container and we'll give the other half to the other container. And the last thing I've got for them is a little bit of paper, a little bit of bedding material, a little carbon source. In the past, I had always taken the coffee filters that I have and I've cleaned them off, rinsed them off, stacked them up, and more recently I've just been setting them aside. These are just full of coffee, coffee remnants, and one of them's a little damp, but most of them have been left to dry out. I'll just tear up some of these and we'll include those as bedding as part of the feeding. So why don't we come in a little bit closer and we'll get started. Things have been pretty run-of-the-mill in this VERMIBAG mini. I haven't really done much other than what you see here is this piece of plastic was recently added. Just a secondary piece of plastic, one that's a little bit larger than the one that was here already. So I mean, to have two layers doesn't make much difference. They both pretty much serve the same purpose. In fact, I could probably just replace the white one with the red one, since the red one is the one that's doing the greater amount of work by reaching all the way out to the outer edges. But for now, I'm just continuing to put them both back into there. What I had done here recently was I had laid out a whole bunch of shredded paper out here on the surface, thinking that it would be a kind of a cool place that the worms might appreciate hanging out in, because the moisture within the bin tries to escape through evaporation. The plastic keeps it in place, sends it right back down, and then it lands on all of this paper. And I think all of these castings that we see stuck to the paper everywhere, as well as these worms that we're finding within the paper right up here on top, are evidence of the fact that it is kind of working the way we're hoping. The worms do seem to enjoy having this material to hang out in. And the same as the the cantaloupe, the banana peels, the same as the food items that we're going to be giving them. The paper items that we add alongside the food also, is typically considered mostly as bedding, but it too ends up becoming food in the long run. So they'll eventually nibble away at this stuff. And, in time it might start to break down a little bit as well, and we might just decide we're going to use it as sort of bedding underneath the food. But for now, I'm going to keep it on the top and sort of continue to give these little guys a little bit of a sort of a moisture haven that they can hang out in near the surface. The only thing is when we're working in here, getting it off to the side and getting it out of our way is a pain because there's so much of it. But you can see there's worms hanging out on the surface, coming up to enjoy the moisture. And the feedings that I apply are almost always right down the middle in this container, in most of my containers as a matter of fact. So we should be able to poke around a little bit right down here in the middle and eventually either stumble on some worms that had been there recently to eat the food that was there, or maybe even, depending, on whether there was a whole bunch of it or not, we can sometimes even find some scraps of the food from previous feedings. This to me looks like a chunk of potato, which I believe might have actually been one of the more recent feedings. Yeah, I think we're seeing some pieces of potato. I guess potato is a sort of a slow item to break down. Here's another kind of slow item. This is just a piece of a mango seed. And if you fold it back together, it's the outer tough shell of the mango seed. You can see where I had cut this mango seed into multiple pieces. But other than some of these slower composting leftover food items from previous feedings, I'm not seeing too much. I mean, this is what a banana peel stem looks like after a couple weeks And it's eventually breaking down. It'll take time. You know, out of an entire banana peel, the stem is obviously the toughest part of it all. But in time it starts to break apart like this, and the worms break it all down. So let's try to open up a little bit of a hole here where we can apply today's feeding. We'll probably encounter a few more scraps of food from previous feedings. One thing I do remember from most of my feedings last week was that when I fed all of my red wiggler bins, I felt like I was being extremely generous and putting in good amounts of food. But from what I remember, the last time these Euros were fed, we didn't give them a huge amount. Not like we did with the red wigglers, where the red wigglers just got, you know, probably enough food to last them for 10 days or 2 weeks, maybe even. Here I felt like coming back here after a week's time. It did seem to make pretty good sense. We can see a pretty good number of Euros hanging out down here, enjoying the food that they've been given over time. So why don't we just plop in today's feeding right into here. We'll go ahead and grab, I guess, half of these. Leave the other few for the other one. And no fancy processing, no shredding or anything like that. I'm just going to go ahead and tear this paper into littler pieces. And just try to spread it around down here within the feeding area. It's kind of like when you're building an outdoor compost bin, right? You're building an outdoor compost bin. Some of your real important ingredients are, I guess, moisture. Moisture is a really important ingredient in an outdoor compost bin, but they always talk about the way you want to have a sort of a good ratio between your browns and your greens, right? In worm composting, it's sort of a similar thinking, where the food items that you're giving them are the greens, the nitrogen-rich items. In this case, it's going to be the cantaloupe rinds and the banana peels, but you also want to include browns. So that's the purpose of this paper here, is that we're including paper as the brown, the more carbon-rich food item. Because once you put in all of this nitrogen-rich food, such as the leftover bits of fruit, as well as all of this nitrogen-rich used coffee, it ends up being a nice combination for the worms to, you know, have a good balance in their diet. Alright, things look pretty nice in here. I'm going to add a little bit of grit here on top of our feeding area. I had been pretty stingy with the grit lately, mainly because I was running so low, but I did process a whole bunch of eggshells that I had been collecting over time, and now I'm stocked up again. So I'm going to be a little bit more generous with the eggshell grit going forward. Okay. Peek at how things are over here. It does feel like stuff on the outer edges is a little bit drier than the material that's in closer to the middle. It is a bag, so the fabric material does, you know, ventilate a little bit. So I guess once in a while it probably does make good sense to sort of agitate the more dry material that's out near the edges and try to bring it in a little bit and let the more damp stuff catch some air. Although, you know, it seems like only on this side is where I felt the dryness. On the other three edges, I didn't really feel things to be that dry. I wonder why that is. Okay. So that's our first European nightcrawler container, the VERMIBAG. I was looking at the tracking spreadsheet. I believe that the age of this bin, at least yesterday, was 80 weeks. 80. So this thing's been around for some time now. So 80 weeks in one day at this point. And a lot of people ask, you know, when are you going to harvest that thing? It's been around for ages. You know, a lot of people say that keeping the castings down low, or, you know, they're just getting very old and maybe over processed and stuff. So I don't know. At the moment, I don't really have any specific plans for doing a harvest on this container, although at some point I probably should, because I've never done one. For all the time that this bin has been in service here, I have never, at this point yet, done a harvest. Which in these containers is pretty straightforward. You open up a hatch at the bottom, eject some of the material that's in there, and then zip it back up. So it's not a complicated thing. But right now I'm just in here to feed. So, all right, let's head on over to the other bin that we've got Euros in and give them a little food too. All right, so now here in this tray, the European nightcrawlers have only been in this tray for, geez, I don't know, a month and a half, perhaps not even that long. And they just came out of, these Euros were simply taken out of the VERMIBAG mini that we just fed. And I worried at first that I had maybe removed so many worms that I'm going to impact the composting capabilities of that VERMIBAG mini, but you saw that we've had a nice number of worms in that container, so nothing to worry about from that point of view, nothing to worry about at all. And same thing as we saw in the other bag, the other Euro container. I had gone ahead and I'd taken a bunch of this shredded paper and placed it across the top. I believe that this went in during the last feeding to give these Euros the same sort of fun little paper playground here on the top as the other container had. So all of these castings that you see scattered around adhering to this paper have all arrived here over the course of the past week. From worms coming up to explore the paper, perhaps not so much out of curiosity about the paper, but maybe more drawn to the moisture collecting on it. And, you know, in time they'll break this down too. They'll treat it as a food source, a good carbon-rich food source to complement the veggie scraps and fruit scraps that they get as their regular feedings. And the same as we always do, I'm going to be feeding down the middle today. And as I recall, the feeding last week in both of these Euro containers was not really very abundant. So we might find some scraps, but I'm not sure how much. I could see quite a bit in here actually. I mean, some of the scraps are stuff like this, this mango seed, which we know is going to take a long time. Stuff like that's always going to take a long time, but a lot of this other material in here, I'm trying to remember what it is that I fed. It does look to me like apple peel, so I believe that what these European nightcrawlers received a week ago was apple. A whole bunch of apple peel that I had. Yeah. A little surprising that we didn't find any in the VERMIBAG mini. We're just finding some here. It is possible that the population of this container is a lot less than the VERMIBAG mini. I can't remember what my estimate was. I would assume that I probably started this bin with maybe, you know, 1,000 volunteers out of my VERMIBAG mini, or approximately thereabouts. And once we start poking around, you know, you can see worms hanging out. There's a good number of them all over the place here. I mean, my experience, anytime I've ever fed apple type foods, apple cores, apple peels, whatever, it always did seem to me like the apples took a little bit of time for the worms to be able to finally break it all down. So maybe it's just a little bit resistant to decomposition, but the worms will eventually get at it. This would be like you know, there was a lot of peels in here, but this would be the core of an apple. You can see worms hanging out down inside of it. Wait, are those worms? Or are they just apple seeds? I thought I saw worms inside. I think they're actually apple seeds. But whatever, they'll eat it all eventually. Lots of leftovers. Definitely some abundant leftovers in this container. I guess this bin just doesn't quite have the capability of the VERMIBAG mini. the slightly smaller population in here. And that's fine. I'm not going to, use that as an excuse not to feed. They're definitely going to get the food I bought down here for them today. So let's begin prepping their food. Same as before, I'm going to lay down, I like to do this, lay down a little bit of bedding material beneath where the food's going to be applied. Because as that food eventually breaks down, starts to thaw out, starts to get consumed, and all of the juices start flowing out of all that fruit, it'll end up in this paper. It'll make the paper a lot more appealing for the worms, so hopefully they'll treat it not only as bedding, but as food as well. That looks pretty good. I believe here too, as time goes on and as some of this shredded paper that's out on the top cover starts to break down, I'll eventually, start turning to that to use that as bedding underneath the feedings. But for now, I'm just going to preserve it the same as we did in the VERMIBAG Mini to keep it as top cover. So we could maybe throw in a little bit of this leftover food that we encountered on our way down. But then we'll proceed with the addition of the new food. I believe that, even though maybe the apple was one of those things that might take a little bit of time to break down, stuff like these banana peels generally start to see some, worm activity pretty quick. Even though, after a week you might still find them intact for the most part. By week 2 you'll find very little of them, I think, in most cases. And same with these cantaloupe rinds. I think by positioning them this way, face up, we'll probably find a lot of worms hanging out in them next time we come in here. Trying to clear out the delicious meaty portion of the melon inside. And they'll break it all down. They'll eat, eat the rinds as well. But that stuff's a little tougher. Might take them a little bit more time to break down. But I think we'll probably have a good little worm party going on here next time we check in. Since we didn't go too crazy giving them a whole lot of food today, I believe that we could probably check in here another week from now. Give both of these bins a little bit more food. When I was feeding my red wigglers last week, I gave them so much food that it did seem to me like, coming back in a week might be a little bit too soon. I thought that I might wait at least 10 or so days before revisiting my red wiggler bins, but over here in the Euro containers, I think we're coming in here at a pretty good time. I mean, they would have been fine with all of this leftover apple scraps. But I always like to sort of back up the previous feedings with a fresh supply on a pretty regular basis. So this is just my basic mode of feeding my worms, and I guess the true ulterior motive here is always wanting to clear out the collection of kitchen scraps that keeps piling up in the kitchen. So as much as I enjoy feeding the worms, I think I even more enjoy making space in the kitchen when I feel like I'm kind of getting overwhelmed with a lot of stuff piling up over time. So let's let's take a peek underneath the surface here a little bit on the outer edges. Something we usually like to do, and at the same time we're going to use some of that material that we pull up to cover up the feeding area. Although I think that the coffee that we used to cover up with is a pretty good sort of a top cover for the feedings. Because I don't think it's the sort of stuff that's going to attract pests or insects. The used coffee seems kind of, it seems like stuff that the worms definitely enjoy, but it doesn't seem to be like the sort of stuff that the, I guess, flying insects might be drawn to as much. So we definitely found a good number of worms hanging out there on the outer edges, which is a good sign. The plastic I used to cover up does reach almost all the way to the outer edges, which is a good thing. But since there is those little gaps around the edges where, you know, a little extra ventilation can occur, I always want to make sure that things aren't drying out on the outer edges of my bins, and that's certainly not the case here. We've definitely got good worm activity on these outer edges. In fact, on this edge over here, it definitely seems like we've got an abundance of worms hanging out here. So I thought that this bin might be perhaps not as densely populated as I thought. And that was all based on the fact that the previous feeding didn't seem to have a big mob of worms hanging out in it, and there were leftovers. But it seems like they're, you know, maybe more interested to some of those older food scraps that go back to feedings that are older. Stuff that keeps getting sort of pushed out to the edge each time I open up the middle to put the newest food portion in. And that kind of makes sense, right? Stuff that's had more time to sort of break down a little bit would be the stuff that the worms can approach more easily and utilize as food than the more newly added stuff. Okay, yeah, I definitely like the way these containers are looking. Good amount of moisture in here. A lot more moisture on this side than maybe is necessary, but I'm not going to worry about that. I believe that a good damp bin is where the worms are happiest. And, you know, if there's dry sections of the bin, they're going to just avoid those areas. They're going to seek out the more damp sections of your bin and spend all their time there. And basically the dry areas are going to have a whole bunch of neglected food and bedding in them. So I like having the bins nice and damp this way, at least in the beginning. Closer to the end, when it's getting near the time when you would want to harvest the castings and, you know, be able to handle them a little bit more easily and have them a little bit more crumbly, you know, you'd want to allow them time to dry off a bit. But in a bin that's still pretty young like this one, maybe 5 or 6 weeks old, I see no problem keeping things perhaps a little bit more damp than is absolutely necessary. Okay, definitely like the way this container's coming along. And I definitely like the way these large pink or red or whatever colored plastic bags cover up the surface of these bins. It seems to be like tailor-made for this purpose. All right, very cool. So there we go. Another week down. We've got our Euros fed. I've made myself a little bit dirty from playing with those dirty coffee filters. I usually try to keep my ungloved hand a little bit cleaner so I could use it to handle the camera, the buttons and stuff. So yeah, it's only coffee, no worries. So yeah, I got some cleaning up to do and I'll put everything away. But I won't keep you around for that because that's boring. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. It really helps and shows that you enjoyed the content so that I can bring you more of the same in the future. And also, if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.